Back home now, the presidency has called the Democratic Alliance's 48-hour ultimatum misguided. The key GNU partner of the ANC has given President Ramaphosa until today, 3 p.m., to sanction other cabinet executives who've been implicated in corruption and wrongdoing, such as Thembisi Melane, David Mahlobo, and Nobuhle Ngabane. Now, the DA is expected to brief on its next steps this afternoon. But let's discuss this with the University of the Free State political analyst, Professor Joleen Steyn-Kotze. Good morning, Professor. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Good to have you always.
Good morning.
Now, Professor, the DA has given the president an ultimatum and the president is not budging. What do you think will be the DA's next move? Will they leave the GNU?
I think that is always for me an interesting question around some of the political dynamics that we see unfolding. And I do believe that while we find two political actors within the GNU now flexing their proverbial political muscle, if you will, to try and say, but, you need to do this, or we're giving you 48 hours to do that. I think the broader picture around creating that administrative stability and governance stability is being lost. I would much rather have liked to see maybe not such a public disagreement, which, as we know, would also not bode well for some of the developmental and I would say policy priorities that the country has.
Now, the president responded on this and said, let it be clear that the president shall not yield to threats and ultimatums, especially coming from members of the executive, that he has the prerogative to appoint in accordance with the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, close quote. Do you believe the strong stance by the president will help to stabilize the GNU or further exacerbate tension?
No, I think we are probably going to see a situation where again, within these political dynamics, you find two parties that may take very hardline positions. And again, once parties take a very hardline position, the principles of compromise, of cooperation, that is so crucial within a very fragile, I would argue, GNU or coalition government scenario becomes lost. And I do hope that both the ANC and the DA would look at the dynamics that have played out at local government level for a few electoral cycles now, and note that once hardline positions are taken, governance and delivery cannot happen.
Yeah, all right. Now let's talk about Steenhuisens' legacy and leadership, Professor. How do you assess John Steenhuisens' legacy as the leader of the Democratic Alliance, particularly in terms of his ability to navigate complex political landscapes and build coalitions, essentially?
Well, I think that is, for me, in essence, the one of the key, I would say, legacies left behind is walking, or not walking, but is building something in a very complex and very changing political environment. So we have to also look at the broader picture. We have a situation where political parties are campaigning and trying to build their support, increasingly where voters are voting with their feet and staying away from the polls. There is high levels or increasing levels of political disillusionment, which of course then also starts bringing to the fore what narratives political parties are pushing, and what are their almost legacy narratives or their legacy policy positions. So we know that, as with previous leaders, John Steenhuisen has really built on the narrative of the success of the Western Cape, the success of Cape Town, where the DA governs, life is better, and so forth. But I don't think we have necessarily seen that narrative translate into building a broader base support for the political party.
Now, in light of his ambition for third term, what specific achievements or decisions during his tenure do you believe will define his leadership legacy within the DA?
Well, I think for me, one of the crucial ones would be how he is going to navigate the current tensions within the GNU. Again, that we are in a situation where the principles of compromise, of cooperation, of collaboration are crucial to the success of government. And one would hope that as a leader of one of the key partners within the GNU, that would be a core focus in terms of, one, leaving a legacy, or two, continuing a legacy of building on collaboration, compromise, and cooperation for the better of the country.
All right. And what significant contributions do you think John Steenhuisen has made to the DA's growth and electoral performance during his tenure? And also, do you think that perhaps his position as cabinet minister may be hindered on his ability to perform within the DA as a leader?
Those questions for me are always very, very tricky, because again, one cannot look and pinpoint and say this was the most significant, or, this was the greatest moment. I do think that one of the key takeaways for the John Steenhuisen leadership legacy, for example, would be probably an element of adaptability, of navigating and changing strategy in the context of changing and more complex political environments.
And Professor, how has Steenhuisen's leadership influenced the DA's relationships with other political parties, particularly in the context of coalition government?
I think for me, that is going to be the tricky one. I don't necessarily think one can look at a party leader and say, this is the impact it has had on other relationships. For me, the question is rather, what is the broader political culture around those key principles I've mentioned: compromise, collaboration, cooperation, and how that translates into political actors working together. If, again, we find very hardline positions, as I've mentioned, at the top leadership, it is very plausible that at a local government or a lower level, one would find similar, almost strong arm tactics, if you will. So one would hope, again, that parties would maybe reevaluate and say, we are going into this space where we can really reflect and look at leadership and leadership dynamics and political dynamics. Let's see what we did well. Let's see what we didn't do so well.
All right. Now let's talk about his prospects for a third term. Now, given the DA's internal dynamics and Steenhuisen's current popularity within the party, what are the chances of him securing a third term as leader?
I always say that my crystal ball is broken. Very often my crystal ball throws out an answer that is not necessarily 100% correct. But, I think that if we look at some of the challenges of the DA, party identity is one key area. The DA was very often put forward as a liberal party with a liberal identity, but we have also seen some center-right moves within the political party itself and also within its policy positions. We have, of course, seen in the media resignations and then also unhappiness driving those resignations. So I do think that in building not just the current leadership, but in terms of succession planning and moving towards building a future leadership generation, the question of party identity is going to become crucial. You cannot have a DA that is merely, we are in opposition, and then calling the governing party out on absolutely everything, or alternatively, we are a partner in a GNU, but then within the GNU, using similar tactics as an opposition party would.
And Professor, if Steenhuisen is unsuccessful, who do you see as a potential successor? And what qualities or experience would make them viable candidate?
I think that for me is always the interesting question. And we have these conversations when we start looking at other political parties as well. If not this person, then who? Who can we say in the background is slated to take up these leadership positions? And for me, I think there's a major gap. In terms of succession planning within political parties, grooming a next generation of leader, both within ideology and policy position, in my view, seems to be somewhat lacking. So it would be, I think, critical for the DA, not just to maintain its current support base, but as any opposition party, and I use that term loosely now, to grow its support base, somebody that can connect with what the bread and butter issues are for many South Africans, because that is generally what drives electoral behavior. Cooperation, compromise, collaboration. Of course, that also requires active listening and listening skills and being able to take softer positions, advocate and advance a political agenda.